Welcome to Sleek Talks. Thank you for joining me. In this episode, I'm going to be checking out 3 Game Boy games: Tetris, Mega Man Extreme, and Donkey Kong Country. And they're all different in some way, not just in the games themselves, but you may notice that each of them have a different shell of some kind. This one is an original gray cartridge, this one is a black cartridge, and this is clear. So, what's going on here? You might have noticed that these first two, Tetris and Mega Man Extreme, have the same shaped cartridge. However, they are different colors. What does that mean? Well, if you see a Game Boy cartridge and it's in gray, that means it is meant to be played on the original Game Boy. And if you see a black cartridge, it's primarily a Game Boy Color game, but it will work on an original Game Boy. But what about this one? What about Donkey Kong Country? The one that's clear, you can see the board inside. Well, if you see a Game Boy game that looks like this, first off, you'll notice that if you look closely on the top it says Game Boy Color, which means this is only a Game Boy Color game. So these clear ones can only be played on Game Boy Color and newer. If you try to play it on an older model, it will not work. Now, what I'm going to do is test these games on different Game Boy models and see which games work on what systems, or which games don't work on what systems. And I am going to be using these models. This is an original Game Boy in clear, a gray Game Boy Pocket, only released in Japan and Korea, a Game Boy Color. This is the clear one that was also only released in Japan and I believe Australia, and the Midnight Blue Game Boy Advance, which I believe is a Japanese Toys R Us exclusive. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go from right to left. So I'll start with Game Boy Advance and end with original Game Boy. So let's start off with Tetris. As I already mentioned, this is an original Game Boy game, so it should work on all of these models. And just a fun fact, this is actually a very early copy of Tetris. One of the first 25,000 if I'm not mistaken, and it has a different main theme. So you know the main theme of Tetris? Well, this doesn't have that. It has a different song in its place. And I am going to try it out on the Game Boy Advance first. So, let's put it in. Yeah, hard to do this on camera. Okay. Flick it on. Yeah, you can hear that different music. But yeah, that looks good. Yeah, seems to work just fine. Alright, next we're going to try the Game Boy Color. And to speed things up, I've already put the game in the system, so let's just turn it on. And it should... Yep, that looks good. There we go. Yeah, seems to work just fine. Alright, we've made it to the first monochrome model. Actually, no, that's not right at all. That's the first monochrome model, but you get my point. This is the Game Boy Pocket. And again, I already have the game inserted. Let's turn it on. Now, the Game Boy Pocket is an updated original Game Boy, so yeah, I mean, it has to work, right? So, yep, that seems perfectly fine to me. And now we're at the original Game Boy, and I mean, come on. I mean, of course it's gonna work, right? This game was literally designed for the original Game Boy. Of course it's gonna work, but you know what? just for shits and giggles. Let's just watch it turn on, do its thing. I noticed that the original Game Boy screen is the only one to have this green tint. The Game Boy Pocket had I believe the Game Boy Pocket screen is a little larger, and it's in black and white instead of black and green. But yeah, it works. No surprise there. And there we have it. To the surprise of, well, no one really, Tetris passed with flying colors. Now, something to keep in mind that Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance are backwards compatible with original Game Boy games. So, of course it was going to work on those. And obviously it was going to work on the monochrome ones as well. Alright, let's move on to the second game, Mega Man Extreme. As I said, this is the one that looks like an original Game Boy game, but it has a black shell. Which means that it is a Game Boy Color game that also happens to be backwards compatible with the original Game Boy. So, theoretically, this one should work on all my models as well. But, of course, we are going to put that to the test. And by the way, can we just talk about the fact that there exists a Mega Man X game for the Game Boy? I mean, I just think that's really cool. Like, imagine having this back in the day. This must have blown people's minds. Alright, enough rambling, sorry about that. Let's get this show back on track. Okay, so I already have the game inserted in the Game Boy Advance, so let's just power it on. I don't know why I had so much trouble there, but yeah, as you can see, power's on. Look at that, we have a full-blown color palette. No more preset color palettes. Oh man, that looks good. Look at that. The beginning of X1 on a Game Boy. I still find this crazy. By the way, I can't really shoot. This is a game where you really need two hands. But yeah. Charge shot. So you can double tap to dash. You can also press start to dash, but I just think that's kind of illogical. I find double tap to be a lot better. But yeah, this game seems to work just fine. Alright, let's move on to the Game Boy Color. Alright, we got the Game Boy Color here. Game's inserted. Let's have some fun. Now, my unit in particular is very weird. You have to press a little hard in start to get it to work. Contacts probably need cleaning. But, this is a Game Boy Color game, so, I mean, of course it's not going to have any problems playing. It's actually a lot easier to play with one hand because the controls are a lot closer together. Yeah, I'm not even... You know what? I might be able to make that jump. Ah, there we go. Ah! Alright. So yeah, I bet there's a lot of people out there that don't know that this game even exists. And we have made it to the Game Boy Pocket, and this is where things get interesting, because, like I said, Mega Man Extreme is a Game Boy Color game, but it's one of the few that is backwards compatible with the monochrome models. So given that this game does work on Game Boy Pocket, does it play any differently? Let's find out. Alright, starts up the same. Now, of course, Of course, we don't have any color here because this is not a color model, but so far it seems to work the same. The dash does feel a bit slower. It might be because the Game Boy Pocket is a slightly slower system, so the game might run a little slower, but it's still perfectly playable. Oh, I did not successfully do a dash there. That was my bad. Well, let's try that again. There we go. So I want to make it as far as the first helicopter. Alright. God damn it. So, oh yeah, it is slowing down a little bit. There's definitely a little more slowdown than there was on the other systems. But, you know, slowdown aside, it seems to play the same. So, yeah. Alright. So, that's another pass. Okay, we've made it to the original Game Boy again. Now, we've seen that it does work on Game Boy Pocket, so it should work on here too, but it is good to test just in case we run into any anomalies. Alright, so far so good. Yeah, it's very hard to see on camera. Maybe if I bring up the contrast a little bit. Okay, that actually is a little better. Oh my god, the ghosting is crazy. Yeah, I don't recommend playing this game on an original Game Boy. You know, unless it's your only option. You're still gonna have fun playing this, but it is a little harder to see things coming. Because the original Game Boy has more ghosting on the screen than the Game Boy Pocket did. But it is playable. You just gotta, be more careful. It doesn't really It is a little easier to see in person what you're doing. But yeah, okay, game seems to work here too. Alright, that's a pass too. And there we go. Once again, the game works perfectly fine on all models. Though do keep in mind that with monochrome ones, there is additional slowdown. Well, well, well. Turns out I have another Game Boy game that's in black. This one is Pac-Man Special Color Edition. And you know what? I'm not gonna waste your time too much with this one. I'll just say outright, my findings were pretty much the same. This game worked on every model I have, and unlike Mega Man Extreme, it doesn't suffer from any slowdown. So I think I can safely conclude that if you have an original Game Boy, Game Boy Color, or Game Boy Advance, you should be good with these. You shouldn't run into any major problems. At last, we arrive at the Game Boy Color exclusive titles. I actually have 3 of them, but for this demonstration, I am going to be using Donkey Kong Country. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, the clear cases are the ones that supposedly do not work on anything older than Game Boy Color. It has to be Game Boy Color or newer. Okay, let's give it a shot. Alright, we got the Game Boy Advance once again. And we have Donkey Kong Country inserted, locked and loaded. Let's give this thing a shot. Now, if you want to play Donkey Kong Country on your Game Boy Advance, I recommend getting the version that is actually designed for this system. And the reason for that is, well, not only do you get a wider field of view, but the physics I find to be more accurate to the SNES version. But the Game Boy Color version is pretty good in its own right. Again, a lot harder to play with one hand since the controls are more far apart. I'm just gonna free Diddy Kong from the barrel. Switching characters works fine. I can roll no problem. Okay, yeah, this game works fine then. Okay, let's go to the Game Boy Color. To be honest, I find this one to be kind of pointless because, I mean, this game was designed for the Game Boy Color. But then again, I did test an original Game Boy game on the original Game Boy, so what the heck. Might as well see how the game was originally supposed to be played. I actually find, personally, that this game is more fun to play on a Game Boy Color than it is on a Game Boy Advance, or at least this version. Yeah, this is much easier to play. Alright. Right. Okay, yeah, obviously the game works. Now let's move on to the Game Boy Pocket. And I am fearing what the result for that will be. Okay, we're on to the Game Boy Pocket. And folks, I am not hopeful at all. I already know that this game is not going to work on this system, but I'm curious to see what it actually does. Or if it's going to like lock up or something. Oh, okay, that's kind of cool. It actually has a unique message. This game is designed only for use on Game Boy Color. And you have Cranky Kong on the bottom left. Okay, that's actually pretty neat. I mean, obviously the game isn't going to be playable on here. If you want to play Donkey Kong Country on your original Game Boy, just get one of these, man. Just get one of these. Alright, I'm actually curious what the original Game Boy is going to show. Well, bugger me. The original Game Boy actually has it even worse. So, the original Game Boy has a locking mechanism as part of the power switch. But the Game Boy Color cartridge blocks it from going all the way in. Which means the system cannot power on, so it's not even going to show a message or anything like that. Well, there you go. Alright, now I'm kind of curious. What message would show up from other Game Boy Color games on the Game Boy Pocket? So, this is Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, another Game Boy Color exclusive, so it's not gonna work, but I wonder if it'll show a message at least. Oh, there you go. Alright, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, this game pack will work only with the Game Boy Color video game system. Alright, not as fascinating as Donkey Kong Country, but still good that it lets you know nonetheless. Alright, here's another one. This is Pong by Atari, an absolute classic. Let's see what this one shows. Oh, this one is even less interesting. Can only be played on Game Boy Color. By the way, I'm gonna go off on a little bit of a rant. Why is it that Pong of all games does not work on Game Boy Pocket or the original Game Boy? I mean, I know it has its, its own unique modes and stuff, but it does have the original unaltered game on there. What do you mean that can't play on this? I mean, come on. They did not think that through. They should have made it so that you could at least play the original version on here. Oh well, it is what it is. Still a good version of the game, though. Well, there you have it. 3 different Game Boy game types, some with unique results. So to summarize, if you have a Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Color, you can play any 3 of these types. However, if you own a Game Boy or Game Boy Pocket, or even a Game Boy Light, you can only play these 2. This will not work. And I know I'm missing some unique ones like the Game Boy Camera and Kirby Tilt and Tumble, but I don't have any of those, unfortunately, so I can't tell you if those work on, specific models. But what I can tell you is that if you own a Game Boy Micro, Nintendo DS, or a Nintendo DS Lite, then I'm sorry to say, you cannot play any of these. As far as I'm aware, those systems will only play Game Boy Advance. Well, thank you for sticking with me, and I hope to see you next time. Farewell.